On this week's Corpus Animus podcast, we talk about muscular endurance and why it could be the missing piece in your CrossFit training.
All right, let's dive into it. Instead of asking you guys what the definition of muscular endurance is, because then that might turn into a snooze fest real quick. We'll get to it. But instead, how about you just tell me, if I don't have muscular endurance, why am I going to suck at CrossFit? Give me just a laundry list of like, you don't have this, so this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. You're going to die here. This is going to be crappy. Hit it.
I think where you'll see it limited most in like the sport or doing CrossFit workouts is like anytime you would see reps more than like 5 to 10 if it's set up in a way like that, meaning the density, when it starts to add up, you just can't push any further and you're limited by the muscles that you're using during that specific movement. Like it stops you kind of dead in your tracks.
I think I would take a different approach. I would say all the gymnastics movements are going to be potentially muscular endurance limited. I think any of the light barbells, so if you're cycling power snatches at 75 pounds or thrusters at 95, 65, those types of movements where you're going touch and go and you're basically just going until one muscle group gives out. You know, if you're doing those touch and go power snatches, at some point my traps and shoulders just cannot continue. If you know you're cycling 225, 155 deadlift, at some point, if you are just trying to go big unbroken sets, the thing that's going to bottleneck you, your glutes, your back, your hamstrings, like that is what is going to be limited, is that cycling of light, moderate loads and the gymnastics stuff.
Yeah, I think just to give everyone maybe more of a feel in their like the real world environment, everyone's been here, right? Like you're doing handstand push-ups and they just fail and you're staring at the wall, or you're doing muscle ups and your lats blow up, or you're holding onto a barbell and then your grip blows up.
Or you're holding onto a kid with one arm and your biceps.
Oh man, the biceps, that's real bad. And I would think that would make my biceps better, but it doesn't.
So muscular endurance work is not hypertrophy work. Keep that in mind.
We'll talk about it.
I can't wait to hear you talk about that.
The reason I bring all those up, and it goes along with what both Mike and Kyle said, but those are the things that end up stopping us in our tracks and workouts, and it is a huge separator, and we talk about it all the time. So we're going to talk about training and like the physiology behind it, but also like thinking about performance. If you don't have good muscular endurance, it's really hard to be good at the sport because you are just standing at the wall staring at it because you can't kick back up and do another handstand push-up.
Well, you touched on something there. You said there that it's one of the things that can bring you to a halt, or one of the things that just, stops you standing in your tracks. And I think that's such a good point, is that if your heart rate and breathing get really high, you can a lot of times just will yourself to keep going through it.
Or just adjust the pace at which you're going. Yeah, just
slow down. So, say you're on a row, you just slow down a little bit. But if you're doing handstand push-ups and you reach local muscular failure, there is nothing else you can do to eke out another rep.
So are we talking more about that? Because there's a difference from like a central limiter, where let's say you have like big sets of wall balls like in a Karen. It's not that most people are actually going to failure on a wall ball, but they feel like such a level of fatigue and burn that they stop because it's painful, and not necessarily that they literally can't pick up the ball and throw it anymore. So there's a difference versus like handstand push-ups where you're literally failing the rep. You're unable to complete the rep.
Yeah, I think, yes, we're talking more about the muscular endurance failure that you would see in a handstand push-up. But I've also experienced that in wall ball, where your shoulders are the thing that gives out. It just at the CrossFit Games this past year for Masters CrossFit Games, we had a workout where we had wall ball, then double dumbbell shoulder to overhead, then we had box step overs, dumbbell snatches, and finished with wall ball. And my plan, I remember very clearly, I was like, I'm going to go do 10s on the last set of wall ball and knock the 50 or 75 or however many it was out. And then I literally couldn't hold the ball in front of my face anymore because my shoulders were so blown up from the double dumbbell shoulder to overhead. That was clearly, a local muscular endurance limitation. And, it can happen in any movement. I've had it happen in rowing, you know what I mean? In cyclical stuff, and running a lot of times my VMO will just completely blow up. And that is the only reason I can't keep running, because my VMO blows up to the point that it cramps, that level of muscular endurance limitation. So while yes, I think the most common thing for people to experience are like push-ups, handstand push-ups, pull-ups. Those are the most common ones. The reality is like muscular endurance can be a limitation no matter what the movement is.
Sure. And it's really important to be able to identify where you need to work. So like maybe it is shoulders or maybe it's legs or, low back, whatever that fatigue threshold is for you. But then also make sure that you're training it because, again, it is such a big separator in the sport. And we spent a lot of time last summer talking about endurance training. And I know Kyle and I did a couple podcasts on like zone 2 and what that means and how you should integrate it into your training. And we got this huge hype train. Like everyone was asking us about this. But honestly, this is probably more important for the everyday CrossFitter that wants to go and do a competition because you got to identify those skills and the movements that you're so limited by that it's going to basically take you from you're crushing a workout to that halting dead stop. And now you're in last place staring at everyone else go up to the wall. So we want to make sure that we are talking about kind of training principles. And I think we'll finish with Mike. You can talk more about like, okay, how would you take this into performance? Like if you're not good at handstand push-ups, how would you pace them? Or good at toe to bar because your core blows up, how would you pace that in a workout?
And we do that a lot in like our programs. We talk about like how to learn what your threshold is on those certain movements so you know how to stay like right below it so you don't blow up in those workouts. But
you brought up a good point. There's kind of two aspects of this, right? You have the pacing aspect, which is what you want to do in a competition workout, and then you have the training aspect. And I think one of the mistakes that people really often make when they're trying to improve their muscular endurance is they're like, oh, well, I'm going to pace this so that I can have the fastest time. So say we're doing a set of 30 strict handstand push-ups and the most you can do in an unbroken set is 10. They're going to look at it and like, I'm just going to do consistent 3s across here because that's going to give me the best time for 30. But that's not necessarily the best way to build
train that quality,
to build local muscular endurance. You really have to take yourself close to failure in each set, step away, have some rest, and then come back to the wall and do another set. So it might be better off for you to do like AMRAP -1 sets all the way across that from a training perspective, but that's definitely not to what you were just talking about, the best way to pace it for the best score.
And I think that's what we want to identify here is, okay, let's actually start the conversation with talking about training principles, and then we'll get to, let's just say someone's doing a Fittest of the Coast competition or Wadapalooza that's coming up or Legends that's coming up, and you have to actually execute on it on game day. That's totally different because you may do sets of 3. We always talk about that in our throwdowns of like, break these up into smaller sets so you don't go to failure. But when we're training something, it's going to look completely different.
Yeah, for sure. So when you're training for muscular endurance, really what you're trying to do is take a movement, I don't want to say to failure because, there's a whole bunch of things that happen when you take a movement to failure, but as close to failure as you can so that you can take a short rest and repeat that set over again. And if you don't go close to that failure threshold and every once in a while spill over that failure threshold, you're not going to give your body the stimulus it needs to actually improve muscular endurance. You're just going to continue to maintain it at this, like, whatever level. It might be a high level, it might be a low level, but you're going to maintain the level of muscular endurance that you have currently. And I don't think we can give people like concrete like sets and rep guidelines, but Brandon, you've talked about this a lot on the podcast that you can just take sport-specific volumes and say, all right, well, handstand push-ups are typically tested around, I'm going to guess 60. Is that pretty close?
Yeah, I would say 60 to 80.
Around 60 to 80 reps.
At the elite level.
At the elite level, right.
When you say sport-specific volumes, you mean what you're going to see in competition?
In competition.
At the
like
highest levels.
Toe to bar, 100 to 125.
Yep.
Right. And so instead of looking at it like, well, I need to do 5 sets of 15, what you're going to do is you're going to say, I'm going to do, use your toes to bar example. I'm going to do 100 toes to bar, and I'm going to do them in the biggest unbroken sets possible that I can, resting 1 minute in between them so that you're at incomplete rest. You're always pushing right to that fatigue threshold, but not to the point that, you have to, doing the toe flick at the end, because that's counterproductive because then you're training a pretty terrible movement pattern. So training right to the edge of failure, come down, short rest, and repeat it. And that is the way to improve local muscular endurance in isolation. But we talked about this before the podcast. That's not the only piece to the puzzle for getting yourself to be able to do those toes to bar in a Metcon.
Yeah. There are several different reasons why you have that muscle endurance limitation. And it could be global. It could be, the inability to recover between those large sets, cardiovascular strength and your ability to basically like recover when you do 2 large sets and you're trying to kind of bridge them together. The other side of it is like the peripheral limitations, those muscles fatiguing out. And that could be because of a movement restriction or movement limitation, which you covered a lot in the endurance episode was, most people think that their endurance limitation is just like, I got to train my heart and lungs more, but it's like, it's movement economy too. Like you have to increase movement freedom. You have to make sure that your technique is on point. So, you should know a difference when doing them, when you're in a workout, like what that limitation is. So let's talk about like how you would discover that.
I want to kind of break this up because I know we're talking about a lot of stuff. So let's start with the movement economy side of it, and then let's talk about kind of what you're talking about with what's actually happening at the local level as far as like we need more mitochondrial density, capillary density, so on and so forth. So with movement, we talked about this in the endurance podcast, but I think it's important to kind of like reframe this. If you were a runner and all you did with bad strides is just train really hard all the time, you can still raise your ceiling. But at some point, you're just going to be running up to it because you can't get your potential any higher because you have bad mechanics when you're running.
Well, there's a limit to how much fitness you can build, right? You can't, like your VO2 max has a ceiling, your lactate threshold has a ceiling, but your running economy or your movement economy, research shows basically has no ceiling. So, and that's true across all movements, not just running.
No ceiling?
No ceiling is what they found. They found that even in older athletes in their late 40s, early 50s, their running economy continues to improve, and they can actually maintain performance into their, I'm not going to say that they're going to maintain world-class level performance, but they're going to maintain their performance pretty close to their peak, despite the fact that all of their physiological metrics, VO2 max heart rate, all that stuff is deteriorating, but they're able to maintain performance because their movement economy continues to improve.
They're using less effort per stride, or in CrossFit terms, per rep than maybe their peers. And I think that is one of the most important things we talk about any kind of training in CrossFit. So Mike, you kind of alluded to this, but like, let's use the toe to bar example because you guys just did the fittest of the coast workout. So this is a perfect example for someone that maybe is really restricted doing their toes to bar versus someone that's not. So kind of break that down.
Yeah. I mean, limited in hip flexion, stiff hamstrings, the inability to fold your body very efficiently is going to show up when you're doing high volumes of toe to bar. And, I went right next to Lisa Gilpin, Matt's wife, who absolutely smashed that workout. Gymnastics background, can fold, compress almost effortlessly.
It's just like super easy for her
but
to
if you
get her
watch
toes
me,
up.
like the first 30 reps in, I'm already starting to like pull my knees up. I'm over relying on my abs to compress. I didn't really feel like a grip limitation that. It was 100% abs throughout that whole workout. Hip flexors going out, and I'm just basically, having to work much harder than I should to compress my body to get my toes up to the bar. So for me, I look at that situation, yes, muscle endurance limitation in the abs, but I could train more toe to bar volume, and I do get a little bit better at it, but to reach like the elite capabilities in that, I have to start moving like Lisa. I have to actually actually have to try and improve the movement economy of actually being able to compress better.
Well, one of the ways that I've tried to address that, because I have a very similar limitation to you. It's like trying to touch my toes is a challenge. But just making sure that whenever I'm doing toes to bar, as an example, I'll, grab a light kettlebell and I'll do some really light, long eccentric Jefferson curls where I basically just drop down into the same position I'm going to be in a toes to bar and do a loaded stretch where I'm letting my hamstrings lengthen in the bottom for just a couple of seconds, 5 seconds, and then I'll stand up and I'll repeat that a couple of reps. And just going through that opens up my hamstrings. And if I do that consistently, there was a point where I was doing that before toes to bar. Every time I did toes to bar and every time I did GHD sit-ups, which was at least twice a week. And I actually had some really noticeable improvements in hamstring length from that. So from we always talk about movement equality, and it seems like it's a complicated, complex thing to improve. And I think in the end, it may not be. So like for someone like you that's trying to improve their toes to bar, who has a hamstring flexibility issue, just doing something simple like that every time before you do toes to bar can be a great way to improve movement economy in that movement.
Yeah, and there's another thing I feel when doing that too. So it was also coupled with, moderately heavy deadlifts. Now, that one thing I didn't realize till after the fact when I was kind of analyzing, how can I get better at this right now instead of just doing like more volume of this and more intensity, is figuring out ways to manipulate tension. Now, this is kind of like an out there idea, but when I deadlift heavy, I'm creating a lot of tension in my posterior chain, which kind of interferes with my ability to compress. So I think it also comes down to what movements are paired with the things that you're having issues with. And you have to look at it and take into consideration, like, how can I be stronger so I'm not having to create as much tension when doing these deadlifts so it doesn't impact my toe to bar as much. And practice for that would be me just making sure that when I'm bracing for the deadlift, I'm not over tense. I'm not like creating too much power and force so that I'm like overexcited and creating all this like global tension. So I go to the total bar and now I'm like pretending that I'm weightlifting again. No, I'm doing a gymnastics movement now. I need to be fluent and loose.
I think that concept is just like you're trying to make everything in the sport like you're on the rower or like you're on the bike. Everything's cyclical, right? Like nice and smooth. I know it's really hard when you're doing a 315-pound deadlift, but most movements you should be able to kind of tone down a little bit unless you're doing a 1-rep max. So step number 1 then would be identify your movement limitations. Would you guys agree with that? Even if we're talking about muscular endurance, like find the movement limitations, clean those up, and be as efficient as possible in those movements.
I see that as like the low-hanging fruit thing you have to focus on first before you go and get all these like fancy protocols on doing like tons of volume.
I think about it like this. If someone comes to me and they were to hire me and they said, man, I really struggle with my biceps on rope climbs, the first thing I'm going to do is be like, all right, cool, film your rope climb.
Yeah.
And then we're going to find some movement limitations. They're probably jumping up, clamping, pulling, and then standing up. So they're using their biceps way more than they should be to complete the rope climb.
I thought you were going to say, have you considered using your triceps?
Yeah. I mean, tricep rope climb.
How do you think I got these bad boys?
That's how you got the biceps climb. But along those lines, that's going to be the first thing that I'm going to do. I'm going to evaluate their movement. How are you completing it? Because most of the movements that we do, at least in the open and quarterfinals level, like they're not strict. Now, granted, there's strict handstand push-ups, but there's a kipping component, or in rope climbs, there's, using your legs. And so it's easy to create more efficient movement patterns by just watching it and giving them skill work.
So you bring up a good point, and I want to differentiate these two. There is a movement limitation in that Mike's hamstrings may be tight and it's hard to do a toe bar. And then there's the skill limitation, which is still considered a movement limitation
for sure,
that Kyle's talking about with rope climbs. You need to identify both. Like if someone says my biceps are blowing up on rope climbs, it may just be that they're rope climbing incorrectly, right? They're using their arms too much when the way we teach it, right, is we're getting a really aggressive hook with our feet and standing up with our legs. We're really not even using our arms. You shouldn't be on a rope climb. Or the same thing is true maybe on a muscle up. Like if they're just pulling with their upper body, we see this all the time, and not using an efficient kip, then they're using too much upper body. Same thing is true though. Movement efficiency matters so much, and that's kind of step number 1, whether it's a skill limitation or if it's an actual like mobility limitation. For me, like going into a squat is a mobility limitation unless I really open up my left knee and ankle. So I always address those, but the actual technique of the squat isn't a limitation.
I'll still kind of stand behind, I think that it's movement first, because if you're trying to teach someone technique and they can't get into those positions, then it's kind of wasted time. Like, of course, you could just go simple and be like, let me just look at the movement. Oh, you're doing this wrong. And if you tell them, oh, you just need to compress more and point your toes, it's like, I can't.
Then you've identified the movement limitation.
Yeah, right.
So it's like you don't want to fix a perceived muscular endurance problem when it's the wrong technique and they shouldn't be fixing
that might be the solution first,
That fixing a muscular endurance limitation when it's actually a technical or a skill limitation is often counterproductive, because what's happening is you're training that local muscle to actually pull more blood and use more oxygen. That's what muscular endurance training is doing, is training the body to actually pump more blood and oxygen into there. And if it's a skill limitation, then you might actually make it so that that muscle blows up faster. Rather than extending the duration that they can continue to do the movement. So I think the first thing you have to do is identify those movement skill limitations and address them, because someone might be bad at kipping handstand push-ups, not because their shoulders are not enduring, but it might simply be that their kipping handstand push-up mechanics are really bad, like their timing. Handstand push-ups are similar to rope climbs in that the timing matters a lot, where you have to drive the legs, then press with the hands. And if you do both at the same time, it's pretty inefficient, because then you're fighting against the momentum of your legs moving in the opposite direction when you try and press out. It's like doing the opposite of what you want to happen. And so I think I agree. Start with the movement, start with the skill. That is the base layer for improving.
All right, start with the movement, start with the skill, but no one's going to do it because this is boring. So what's the next step?
Well, yeah, I mean, after that, let's say that someone is truly trying to get better at
I'm
CrossFit.
just spitting facts.
It's true.
Everyone's like, come on, what's step 2? I ain't going to do that.
Well, if you jump to
Give me
step
the protocols.
2, if you jump to step 2, you're not going to get that much better. And this happens I mean, we see this even at the highest level of sport. People still move poorly and they wonder why they can't get on the podium or whatever it may be. Going to step 2, I think that's when you can look at like the physiological side, what's actually going on at the local level, and is it a global issue that Mike talked about? So what I mean by that is maybe a cardiovascular limitation or a respiratory limitation. Those can play into, I'll let you talk about that, Kyle, the local issue that you're having, like if your heart's not pumping enough oxygen-rich blood or you're not dispelling enough CO2, those things can cause issues at the local level. Or it can actually just be a local limitation. Like you just haven't trained forearm endurance enough, and then we can get into protocol. So let's talk about the global picture first of, yes, you still need to have a healthy cardiovascular system and a good respiratory system to have good muscular endurance.
Yeah, so if you think about it, muscular endurance is predicated upon the ability of the whatever muscle we're talking about. So you're talking about your forearm.
Let's go with toe to bar and abs.
Yeah, okay. So
selfishly,
ignore the forearm, and we're going to focus on the abs. So basically, abs are a muscle just like any other. They're going to consume oxygen in order to produce energy, to recycle ATP. That's what they're doing in order to just continue to work. And when you're doing high density movements, one of the things that's happening is you're using a lot of energy, and you have to be recycling that quickly. Well, our body has to take oxygen into it. So our heart is our kind of delivery system for that blood and oxygen. And if your cardiovascular system isn't developed enough to push blood and oxygen into the working muscles, the abs in Mike's case with the toes to bar, fast enough to keep up with the rate of movement, then you're going to end up producing lactate and hydrogen ions. Lactate isn't really the thing that causes the burning. I have to preface everything with that, or else I'm going to get hit.
I love what you said before the podcast, Brandon. The exercise nerds love to point out. It's not lactate. It's not lactate. Because if we didn't say it, some asshole in the comments can be like, it's actually lactate.
Exactly. And Chris, you even said it right now.
No, I said that. No.
It's going to show up in the comments anyway. Yeah. So anyway, you produce lactate. No matter what, you are producing hydrogen ions, but you're also producing lactate. And at that point, the muscle is going to fail, right? That's when the muscle starts to slow down, contraction speed. You start to get a reduction in force production, and that's when the wheels come off the bus.
That's when you're staring at the wall.
And when I was watching Mike do the workout, that's when he started to do his toes to bars in twos instead of sixes.
Kind of like a tangent here, but not really a tangent, but in relation to this. So a lot of people, they'll feel that limitation directly in that muscle. Like it's local to my abs getting tired. However, there are times where I'll reach muscular endurance failure, but my heart rate is so high and I feel like I'm out of breath because of that. So talk about like the process and the mechanisms of what caused that, and why some people, when they think, oh, I was breathing, I was out of breath, where it could actually be a muscle endurance limitation that's causing that.
Yeah. So the example I used before we got on the podcast is Murph, right? There's a lot of people who are really good at push-ups if you just are doing push-ups, but as soon as you mix it into a Murph setting, and now they're 25 minutes into the workout, they've already run a mile, they've already done 100 pull-ups, and they're like halfway through the push-ups, and all of a sudden the wheels fall off. They're like, well, normally I can do push-ups, but right now I can't. When your heart rate gets really high, there's a couple of things that happen. One, when you're doing something like Murph or a mixed workout, you've got to send blood to a lot of different muscles, right? So you just you did chest to bar, so it's a whole bunch of different working muscles. You got your forearms, your biceps from the pull-ups, your lats from the pull-ups, you got your chest and triceps from the push-ups, you got your abs from balancing, maintaining your trunk during the push-ups, and then you got your legs from. So there's blood going all over the place, and you have a limited. We have a finite supply of blood, and the heart has to get blood to all of the working muscles. And so one of the big challenges is when you're doing muscular endurance movements inside of a Metcon with a high heart rate, there's just less blood to go around to those working muscles. So they're just not going to be able to work as deep into fatigue as they normally would. The other thing that happens is as you're building up all that lactate and hydrogen ions, you have to get it out of the muscle and to other adjacent muscles in the heart and the liver, where it can be lactate can be reused as a fuel source in the heart, and it can be turned back into glucose and glycogen in the liver. Like you can reuse that as a fuel source, but if it stays where it's at, if it stays in the local working muscle, it's just going to stop.
Yep.
All work will stop. And so if you can't get enough blood and oxygen in there to flush that back out and take it to the rest of the body, then again, that's where some of that kind of central limitation is going to play a role in your ability to do
why training the cardiovascular system can help with that.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons I love the idea of combining, and you guys do this and compete all the time, where you do an erg into muscular endurance work. Like you might do, a 1K. I just saw this, I think last week, but it was like a 1K Concept 2 bike into a minute of 3 different, like all similar muscle group, muscular endurance movements. It was, I don't remember the exact, I wish I could remember it, but it would be like toes to bar, GHD V up. That's a terrible example. But you get your heart rate up first on the erg, and then you go into 3 very similar movement patterns that are all meant to kind of compound fatigue as they go. And I think that's a great way to address that part of the muscular endurance limitation, because like I said, you might be really good at push-ups, but then you do them in Murph and it's a little bit different. That's a huge problem, but you can train that. You could do 400 meter run and then do a max rep set of push-ups, rest, recover, repeat. That would be a good way to address that.
So that's the cardiovascular system, and it's extremely important for the sport of CrossFit. We're not discounting that by just talking about muscular endurance today. That's why I brought it up. And obviously, if you don't have a healthy cardiovascular system, it's really hard to have a really strong and enduring local system too.
So is there an order of operations there?
Well, you could do both at the same time. I think, Kyle, you can speak to this a little bit more, but like, I'll use the ab example since Mike is on the toe to bar kick.
It's a good example.
But let's say that I ski once or twice a week, and I'm being very aggressive with core flexion over and over and over again. I can actually, doing that at a slow, steady state, help build up some mitochondrial density, maybe the size and number of mitochondria in the local muscle that then will help when I start doing most muscular endurance training. So that's a benefit of doing slow and easy work. And then the other thing just in general is getting your heart to pump correctly. We talked about this with zone 2 training. We want to be able to get enough blood through the body quickly, but we also need to have the stroke where we're filling our heart up all the way. A lot of times I think people just do high intensity training and it's like do with their heart, but they're not actually, I used this analogy last time of like a bike pump, right? I'm trying to pump the air all the way into the pump and then pump it into the tire. That's what our heart should be doing. So we need to get efficient at that first so that the oxygen rich blood can get to the abs or the forearms or whatever.
Is that what the Grinch was doing?
Yeah. What was he doing? I don't get it.
Oh, his heart was too many sizes too small. Is that what you're talking about? Exactly. No, but Brandon, you brought up a really good point here, and that is that you have to do low tension work in order to get the heart to actually expand, to increase stroke volume. But there's another part to the equation of cardiac output, and that is how much pressure the heart is pumping against on the back end, right? So anytime you're under tension, so imagine doing a front squat, for example, right? That's going to create a lot of systemic tension. You have to brace to hold the bar. Your quads are basically as tight as they possibly can be, moving through the eccentric and concentric. Like, you create a lot of tension to do a heavy front squat. So if your heart rate is really high and it's pushing against a lot of pressure, then less blood is going to leave the heart, even if you take that big full pump. With your analogy, there's going to be less blood that leaves the heart. And so that's another factor. So when you're doing muscular endurance work, if you have already got this big pump, Mike and I were talking about a workout that we did just the other day that was a combination of ring muscle ups and strict handstand push-ups. And I did the first round stupidly unbroken and had just a crazy pump. There's no way that my heart was going to be able to push blood through all that pressure. And it's just not going to be possible. It's also not a good way to do cardiovascular work if that's really what you're trying to train. But at the same time, you have to do that to be able to break through that kind of pump and blockage. You have to train it some if you want to be able to do it in the sport.
Yeah. So there's like an alternative approach to that as well. So if you've got a specific movement that you're trying to improve. So we talked about cardiac fatigue, getting respiratory rate up, getting your heart rate up, and then going into the movements. But then there's an alternative to that of, I want to train handstand push-ups, and then I want to improve my ability to recover between those large sets. So we do this a lot in Compete, where you'll do like AMRAP -1, actively spin on the bike, so that you're keeping the heart rate up a little bit, and you're trying to train its ability to somewhat break through those blockages when you've occluded in that local tissue, right? Like you're trying to overcome that pressure. And those are ways that you can continuously build in your ability to hit bigger sets of those things and recover faster.
I think that there's probably 2 levels to that. The first is exactly what you were talking about, where say you do an upper body movement, like handstand push-ups, max rep set, build up all that occlusion and all that pressure in the upper body, then jump on a Concept 2 bike and do an easy spin, right? It helps to pull the blood out of the upper body and flush it down into the lower body. That's that kind of flushing I was talking about. But then I think at level 2, what you're doing is you're going to do handstand push-ups and upper body movement, but then you're going to recover on the ski erg, where you're trying to get the muscles that are adjacent to the working muscles to actually be the ones that are pulling and recycling the lactate and pulling that blood back out. And I think those are both important in the sport, because we have workouts sometimes where you go upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower. And that's where you do kind of like the level one. And then we have the ones that are just dense compounding fatigue.
It's redundant.
Yeah, it's just upper, upper, upper. And I think you've got to do both. And I think those are, once you've addressed the movement limitations and you've addressed some of the, isolated muscular endurance, like you've done handstand push-ups on their own, I always think that that's the next step, is to do, contrast, where you do upper, lower. And then once you got someone pretty good at that, then you start the compounding upper, upper, and then you put it in metcon.
Or even a tier before that, just start with a basic volume progression, right?
Yeah. That's like, when I said isolation, that's what I meant. Yeah, you're just doing them in isolation and building up their tolerance to that movement alone.
Yeah.
Cool. I want to talk about some of the training protocols in a second, but let's finish with the global limitations. We talked about cardiovascular limitations that you got to improve. Respiratory limitations also play a role, especially with things like toe to bars and anything where you got to control your diaphragm. But we also need to be able to get enough oxygen in, because that's going to get into the heart and then go to the muscles, right? You need the oxygen at the muscle. And then you also need to get the CO2 out so that your blood doesn't get too acidic. And I think you talked about this a little bit, but that's where you start getting that pump too if you have too much CO2 that's in the muscle.
This is really interesting, because CO2 is a really powerful vasodilator. And so it leads to, when CO2 levels get high, it leads to the blood vessels widening and more blood flowing to the tissues. Now, if you're someone who's already pumped from doing a max rep set of handstand push-ups or whatever, toes to bar in Mike's case, his abs are already pumped, then it's just going to make it so those blood vessels get wider and wider and wider, and it's just going to force more blood and more compression in there. And he's going to get to the point where, like, he's so pumped that he literally can't use the muscle. There's so much tension in there, it can't contract anymore.
There's no worse feeling than failing a toe to bar. It's so humbling. You're like,
you just can't get your toes up. Any movement, man. It's just awful when you feel good and all of a sudden you don't, right? Like it happens fast. Yeah. So you need to also have a healthy respiratory system. That's kind of covering the bases there. So now let's dive into local muscular endurance. And I think let's just jump into the training, because we already kind of talked about the concepts here, right? So what you guys started this process, but let's just say that you have an athlete that's coming in and they have good movement. They're pretty healthy and fit, but they're like, my abs, since I'm going to use your toe to bar example, aren't working correctly. Anytime I do toe to bar, they start blowing up right away. What are some basic, where would you start them, and then how would you progress them through maybe a 6-month period?
As we said, we'd start with movement. So the first thing that we would do is I would have them do, if it were Mike, I'm going to use Mike as my example, because I feel like that's the best starting point. First thing I'm going to have them do is let's do a standing toe touch. Let's do a seated toe touch. Let's see what your hamstring flexibility looks like, especially since Mike in our consult told me that, his hamstrings weren't particularly flexible, and that's what he felt like. So that would be the first thing. Then I'd get him up on the toes to bar and watch him do some toes to bar. I've seen enough of Mike's toes to bar to know they're pretty efficient, given his movement limitations. Like, it's not like he has
a trade-off. If you can power clean a lot, like, he's got a lot of
exactly. If you're a strong boy,
there's nothing majorly wrong with Mike's toes to bar, right? He doesn't use like a scoop style, which I think definitely overtaxes the abs versus like a bigger sweeping kip. Yeah. He breathes in the right places in the movement in general. So like all that stuff looks pretty good. Now we're like, all right, Mike needs to get better at toes to bar. The first thing that we're going to do with him, it's like Mike had suggested, is build the volume. So we know that sport requires 100 toes to bar, maybe 125, or in that Fittest of the Coast workout, 150 toes to bar.
It was a lot.
It was a lot. We're going to just start by accumulating 100 toes to bar in the way that I would write it, fewest sets possible. 1 minute rest between each one. Just record your sets. And we might even just repeat that exact piece for a couple weeks in a row until he's doing them in 4 sets, 25, 25, 25, 25, which, do you think you could do that right now? 4 by 25 with a minute rest?
No.
There's a 0% chance I could.
I could do 2 sets probably.
2 sets of 25?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be the goal, would be to get him to pretty consistent sets. Now, granted, we might see some deteriorations. First set might be like 35 and down.
Yeah. But the way you would program this is week 1, it'd just say 100 for time, rest 1 minute between your sets, and you're going close to a max and broken set each time, right?
Yeah.
As few sets as possible. Then next week you say, hey, the goal is, you're still doing 100 for time, same protocol, but the goal is that you're doing more reps on each of the sets or fewer total sets.
Yep. And so I would just continue that until we hit a marker. Okay, he's done it in 4 sets. That's a good point. Then we would start to do some of the mixed fatigue work that we had talked about, where I'd say, all right, Mike, what we're going to do is you're going to do, we'll start with a bike erg. We'll do a 1K bike erg, 25 toes to bar, rest 1 minute times 4 sets. So we're putting a little bit of cardiovascular fatigue into the system before he does the toes to bar, and just repeating that. And that I would probably create a little more variance within the week. So that might actually be like the first week would be bike erg. The second week might be echo, which is going to be a little more cardiovascularly demanding. And then the next week might be rowing, which, already has some hip flexion in it. And the last week might be a ski erg, like 500-meter ski erg into that 25 toes to bar. But
this is the crazy thing about training elements in the sport, because there are so many different variables. Because you've seen instances where in a single modality setting, let's say someone could do like almost 50 unbroken toe to bar. Like you think, wow, their toe to bar are really good. The second you add any interference to it or put it in a 20-minute AMRAP, they may not be as competitive. Like it's wild how different it can be. So I've always found myself to be that way because I'm very strong. Like I can like fight through and hold on to big sets of things, but when it comes to the endurance of it, right, the muscular endurance of it, like the ability to fight off that fatigue for as long as possible, that's where it really starts to drop off. And my question would be, is that due to it being more of like a volume issue? Because when I do my max set, 50 is not like the volume, that's 100 less reps than you would see in that 14-minute AMRAP of the fittest of the coast. Is it just purely a volume thing, or is it just the ability to be really strong in a movement and then not be able to break it up and sustain it long term? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think there's a difference between having high muscular endurance in a movement when it's in isolation. This is the Murph example, right? Yep. Be able to do a lot of push-ups in isolation, but can't do push-ups very well in Murph.
Yep.
I think it's that exact thing. So once you mix all those fatigue signals, you get all that, your heart rate's high, that there's more CO2 already built up. There's more lactate being built up because there's less blood and oxygen available to those working muscles because there's already other working muscles. When you have all of those things mixed together, that is why you have lower capacity in mixed movements versus when it's in isolation. And I just think that you have to address that with some sort of progressive mixed structures eventually. Like you can do, we could do that, the 100 toes to bar, rest a minute, and we could do a density progression where you did 100 toes to bar, fewest sets possible. The first week you do it with a minute rest. The second week you do it with, 50 seconds rest. The third week with 40, the fourth week with 30, and just cut 10 seconds rest off each one. And you would continue to get better at doing toes to bar in isolation. And I think that's the foundation for getting better at them in a Metcon, but it's not the solution to getting them better in a Metcon. The solution to that is more complex. It's you have to do the foundation work first, then you have to do it in some sort of a controlled mixed setting. This is what you guys do in compete really well. And then the last piece is you have to go do them in Metcons that are like the one that you want to improve in, which in your case was a hinging, it was box jump, so very hip flexor dominant. So we might do in a week where you do like 15 cal row, 12 toes to bar, 9 kettlebell swings. Yeah. That would be awful, by the way. The grip,
that'd be really hard.
The grip compounding fatigue coupled with the hip flexor fatigue from the row. That would be
and
terrible.
Still being compressed in the row. Your abs aren't really getting a rest when you row. Like you're bracing as you open up in the swing. Yeah. My abs always cramp up when I row.
Same.
Yeah.
Not always, but for someone in Mike's position where if he says like, hey, I could do 50 unbroken toe to bar and it's not an issue, but again, putting him into a Metcon, you definitely need to scrimmage that more, meaning do more
of the
that.
Sport. Scrimmage it. That's a good way to put it.
But I also like to take a pretty holistic approach where likely it is a cardiovascular or respiratory limitation that's holding him back. And so he would do, like, for example, if it is toe to bar, I would have him do more ski erg work as opposed to more running and rowing. Whereas if someone had a squat endurance limitation and I needed to do more easy work, it would be rucking. They'd be doing way more rucking. It's not a squat pattern, but just building, again, mitochondrial density in the legs or in the toes to bar, in the abs for the toe to bar is going to help. And so he may do one day a week where it is a lot of ski, low intensity intervals. And then we're mixing ski erg, toe to bar, ski erg, GHD, sit up, toe to bar, hinge pattern, toe to bar, into his training that's actual like scrimmage-based work later on in the week.
I can confirm this because just from training experience and history, and I've actually seen this with a lot of athletes, my muscle endurance feels really crappy when my conditioning is poor. even though I've been doing at the moment, let's say I've been doing a ton of bodybuilding, which is you're doing a lot of reps. Like you're doing, high time under tension, a lot of repetitions. So you would think it carries over. Second I go do it in a CrossFit mix setting, I'm cramping up, like I'm going to failure quickly. But when my conditioning is up and maybe I haven't actually hit as many reps or volume on certain things, I actually feel way better and I recover better between those efforts. So I see that with a ton of athletes.
Bodybuilding is one of the things that we haven't talked about, but also is a tool for improving local muscular endurance. If you identify that someone truly has an isolated muscular endurance issue, so you've gone through all the evaluations to determine on their rope. I think rope climbs are a better example here than toes to bar, but you've gone through and you determine, okay, their rope climb mechanics are good. They're okay with rope climbs in isolation. They're okay when they're mixed, but at some point their biceps are still the limitation. That's where you can start to incorporate some more bodybuilding stuff. I think things like towel grip or rope grip, kettlebell curls, even doing some towel grip carries, very specific like rope climb pulls, or one of my current favorites is to attach the rope attachment to the lat pull down that we've got out there and have people, set up in a very similar grip to their rope climb and do some lat pull down, basically lat pull down to failure. Do that with single arm, lat pull down to failure, so that you are really training the muscular endurance for those things. Now, if you're doing that, you need to make sure that you're picking training loads that let people get like 12, 15, 20 reps. Because if you start to go lower than that, then you're starting to do like hypertrophy style bodybuilding, and getting the weak muscle bigger is not necessarily going to make it more enduring, and often will do the opposite of that.
Yeah. You don't want to have giant arms and then still not be enduring. I've had that problem in my life.
Is this the Brannen
the biceps?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that a lot. You have athletes that need to be better at strict handstand push-ups, and they put on a ton of upper body muscle mass, and they just get more closed off. Like they're
especially if
unable to
you get rolled forward.
Yeah. And maybe there's a little bit of improvement, but it's more so from like nervous system adaptations than it is from actually like making the muscles more enduring at the local level.
Yeah. So if you're going to use that kind of bodybuilding style work, make sure that the rep ranges are very high, right? 15 to 20 would be my recommendation. And I know that that's like a really common recommendation for muscular endurance in training literature.
That's the algae zone.
Yeah. It turns out though that it's pretty effective at doing that. And if you go below that, then you are going to end up in that sort of more hypertrophy biased training. And just getting a muscle bigger isn't going to make it more enduring. Often it will do the opposite, because then it can pump with more blood. It pumps earlier. Like, it's just not the best solution for, even though it might be fun, right? And if your triceps are the limiter on handstand push-ups, then doing some tricep hypertrophy might look really good, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make your handstand push-ups better necessarily.
All right, so let's jump back into the protocols. You talked about the first thing is that we're looking at the movement. You did that. Mike looks pretty good. Now he's isolating the movement. So he did the build to 100 and as few sets as possible.
Yep.
He does that for so many weeks. He crushes it. Now he's like, hey, in a Metcon, I'm still not very good at them. So then he adds in, maybe it is 1 week a bike. Next week it's a row. Then you finish with the ski erg, because that's more kind of redundant. Where do you go after that? Maybe you do a ski erg into 25 toe to bar, rest so many minutes times 4. What's the next step after that?
What I like to do for the next step would be like 4 rounds of ski erg toes to bar. So
now it's looking more like CrossFit.
Yes, we're taking out the rest, but we're still keeping it very cyclical. So the great thing about using an erg is that Mike can control the pace on the erg, where if it's mixed with other movements, he's going to have to take rest and things like that. So it allows him to keep his heart rate up, create a very similar type of fatigue that he's going to experience in a Metcon, but not necessarily be blowing up. Right, because that's what I don't want. Is I don't want him getting to the point where he's doing his toes to bar in sets of 2.
Yeah,
like at the end of a Metcon. I don't want him there yet.
Yeah. Real quick, I think this is extremely important, because everyone's going to probably skip the first few steps and just say, well, I'll just do it in Metcons, because one, that is more fun, and I totally get that. And 2, it's just more accessible. Like, it doesn't take as much time just to do 4 rounds. So the problem with this, though, is if you go in and you just do the 4 rounds of, let's say, 500-meter ski erg and 25 toe to bar, which for most people is going to be pretty challenging. By set 1, probably, you're already at doubles or maybe even singles, and then you're not building muscular endurance. You're just trying to hang on for the next 3 rounds.
We talked about this at the beginning. It's the difference between strategy and training. And as soon as you do that, you're no longer training muscular endurance. You're just Like you're using I'm going to get done with this as fast as I possibly can strategy, which is not the most effective way to build muscular endurance.
And you'll notice that Kyle's talked about this, Mike's talked about this. When they're thinking about protocols, a lot of it's intervalized, right? Because we want to be able to rest so that we can do bigger sets, so that, again, we're training the actual endurance of that, whatever that local muscle is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think on just like a basic level of why we intervalize, because it needs to be progressive. Like you need to be able to add to it next week. If it's just constant failure every week, it's not sustainable. Like you're not going to be able to add 3 to 5% in volume. You're not going to be able to have micro progress so you can see that you're actually making changes as you go. So just something to keep in mind of like why that's important, not just because we say intervals equal training all the time.
And I think it's really important to point out. So Mike said progress. One of the ways to progress, like we talked about that hundreds workout, one of the ways to progress is to increase the density. So I'm asking Mike to do more in each set, which is one form of progression. So I know a lot of people hear progression, they automatically think, well, I got to add volume or I got to add load. But don't forget that one form of progression is density. Another form is intensity, doing the same thing and doing it faster. So, if that 100 toes to bar the first time took him 10 minutes and now we're doing it in 7 minutes, that is an intensity progression. Right. And so keep in mind that you don't always have to be adding volume. If you have someone like Mike who already can do 100 toes to bar, but doesn't need to necessarily be able to do 150. Well, if you think about the sport, density is the thing that's tested in this sport. Your ability to do big, dense sets as frequently as possible, as repeatable as possible. So don't always get stuck on the idea of progressing volume, especially in muscular endurance, because in the end, your goal with muscular endurance adaptations is to increase the density or intensity of your workouts.
Yeah, I mean, a good example is take the Fittest of the Coast workout. You got 10 rounds, and that's what
Can
I
you
want to
actually name the work or say the workout?
It was 14-minute AMRAP, 15 toe to bar, 10 box jump overs, 5 deadlifts. To be competitive, I need to strive to hit that 10-round mark, and I was like 9. So we know that 10 rounds is 150 toe to bar. So do the math on that, split that up by 14 minutes, and like every minute 10 or something, you need to be able to complete 15 toe to bar. I don't have that threshold. So like that's a density progression that you could work on improving. So you could start with saying, all right, well, I'm going to work on doing 15 toe to bar every 120. And then the next week go down to 115. The next week go down to 110, so that you're pushing yourself to meet that standard of what you're realistically able to chase. That's like a sport specific approach. That's like kind of how we game it to, achieve the task on a sport level.
All right, so we started doing rounds for time. So this looks more like CrossFit, but there's not a lot of like redundant fatigue. In other words, he is doing the ski erg with toe to bar, so there's some of that, but we are managing it by the cyclical pace, saying, Mike, you're going at a 208 pace on the ski erg into toe to bar. Maybe the next week he's going 206, and we're just adjusting the intensity based off of that. What happens when Mike tells you, hey, the one thing that really caught me up was doing the deadlifts and feeling like I had a ton of tension going back to the toe to bar? That blew me up. So then what's the next step?
So that's where things start to get a little fuzzy. It's not clear. Do we keep the ski erg in there and add a deadlift, or do we say, all right, now we're going to take these two movements, since we know deadlift and toes to bar are the couplet that Mike is struggling with right now. Do we take that and do we put it by itself, like say in an EMOM? So every minute on the minute, Mike, you're going to do 10 toes to bar, 5 deadlift at 275, like the workout, right? And you're going to do that. Say we're going to start with, and that would be 100. So 10 minutes, that'd be 100 and 100 toes to bar and 50 deadlift. I don't think that would be very easy.
I'm going to scale up.
You're going to scale up.
Too easy, Coach.
Yeah. So I think you might start somewhere like that, or you might make it more intervalized. That's still intervalized, but not by much. I mean, Mike's going to be getting 10, 15 seconds rest after each set.
Yeah, it's still a Metcon.
It's going to get really dense. But you might also turn it into something where you're doing like 15 cal ski, 10 toes to bar, 5 deadlift, rest 30 seconds times, 8 sets, 10 sets, something like that, where you're still going with your target volume of 100 toes to bar, but now we're getting 50 deadlift across the workout, but we're still keeping some pre-fatigue to keep the heart rate up that he can control. But now we got this little bit of rest, and that little bit of rest lets you play with it each week, where you could take that down to 15 seconds rest between sets. Oh, now Mike's doing 10 rounds for time.
At what point are we testing actual workouts? So, for example, let's just say he wanted to, I don't think this is great just to focus on one workout, but if he wanted to only get better at this workout, are we testing and retesting, like beginning and end, middle of the cycle? Like what would you do with an athlete?
I think in this case, once Mike was successfully completing like that EMOM structure, I would say, all right, let's go ahead and retest and see how you do. And what I would do as a coach is listen to his feedback.
Yeah.
I'd just be in communication with Mike. And as soon as he said, hey, I finally feel like my toes to bar are feeling good here, that's when I would be like, all right, hey, we're going to do the retest. We're going to deload next week, and then we're going to do the retest the following week. Or maybe we won't deload and just do it. But I just listen to the feedback.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you identify a very common limiter like that, it's okay to train it like real specific, because it's such a common pattern that you would see, like grip fatigue going into compression, or like hinging combined with like toe to bar grip gymnastics. So I think you're covering basis for a lot of workouts that you would see in the sport by just training those things specifically.
Brandon,
we do that and compete. Like that's one of the weekly progressions we have is, like grip endurance with hanging gymnastics, with barbell cycling and so forth.
Yeah.
We've talked about how it's probably not best to pick a target and train for the target. However, I agree with Mike in this instance. There's certain combinations that I think it makes sense. One of which is grip couplets, like deadlift, toes to bar. But the other one is, and this is less muscular endurance, but maybe there's a little bit of a component here, bar facing burpee and power snatch for some athletes, or bar facing burpee and thrusters for other athletes. If they're really good at squatting, then we'll stick with the bar facing burpee power snatch. If they're better at hinging, then we'll stick with the bar facing burpee.
It's just a burpee and barbell, whatever their limitation is on the barbell. I agree, because it comes out every year.
And that couplet is, if you're not prepared for that type of couplet, it is terrible.
Yeah. All right. Let's, before we talk about pacing, I wanted to, Mike, kind of like let you guide that conversation. Let's just throw out some other protocols, like for fun, for the people at home that are like, let's get off a toe to bar for a little bit. Let's say it's handstand push-ups. My handstand push-ups are really limited. I need to get better at them. Are there any other things that you guys maybe would do? I know we already talked about, kind of walk through the isolation, then slowly add some other stuff. But
Bring them in. Bring in the BFR champ.
That's where I was going to go. My absolute favorite handstand push-up protocol, and I have had 100% success with this. And when I say success, I'm talking about taking people's. I'll give you my example.
They went from 0 to 100 handstand push-ups.
0 to 100. Yeah. No, that's actually infinite progression. No. So I had an athlete who qualified for semifinals in 2021, and he somehow managed to snake through all those that super dense handstand push-up, double dumbbell, shoulder overhead, double under workout that was in there. He snuck through there and ended up qualifying. But we knew that strict handstand push-ups are like a huge limiter. His max rep set was 11. And he was going to semifinals, and he was going to the Vegas semifinal, right?
I know who this athlete is.
Yes.
That's actually incredible.
I was like, all right, we need to pull out all the stops, and we're gonna see. So I gave him my BFR handstand. I invented a BFR handstand push-up protocol for him, which is
for the folks at home. What's BFR?
Blood flow restriction training. Basically, you take a tourniquet, for lack of a better term, that you can inflate. You put on the limb, and you can inflate and set to a very specific pressure. It's based on that individual's limb occlusion pressure. So basically, it's the opportunity to restrict blood flow into and out of a limb.
And it just looks cool.
Yeah, it does.
Look cool when you're
Makes
doing
your arms look gigantic.
This is pretty complicated-ish if you've never done it, and you should probably have a coach.
100%.
Well, we've got tons of videos.
Yes,
that we could reference and share
for BFR stuff. You need to go through and do like a medical clearance, because if you've got cardiovascular issues, you can't do BFR because it's completely contraindicated.
And there's ways you could set it up that really screw you over, right?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. So like putting it, if you put it distal on a limb instead of proximal, like you want to keep it up as high on the limb as you possibly can. There's all this stuff. We literally have.
Don't put it around your neck. Sorry.
No, unless you're in that
goes without saying. However, maybe we do need a caveat in here for some people. Anyway, the protocol, we basically go to 60% of his maximal occlusion pressure, and I would have him do every 90 seconds a max rep set of strict handstand push-ups. As soon as he was done, he would get on the echo, and he'd ride at like a pretty easy pace. We started with 5 sets. We built a 10 set. So it was 15 minutes with around 60. I think we may have even progressed his BFR pressure up to 70 as this went, up to 70. And across the 5 weeks that we did that, his max rep strict handstand push-up went from 11 to 24. So when I say 100% success rate, I've now done this with dozens of people and given it to other coaches at TTT who have done it with other, dozens of other athletes, and everybody across the board has had significant improvements. Even people who couldn't do a strict masters athletes who couldn't do a single strict handstand push-up, we would do this same protocol with a riser. They would get done, and they're ripping off sets of 7 or 8. Like, huge improvements with something like this.
I feel like we could film a whole episode on getting strict handstand push-ups better, because it's pretty difficult sometimes. They're very stubborn. So what had you tried in the past, and why did you go this route versus, because somebody's going to ask, like, oh, I guess I'll go do BFR now. And it's like, whoa. Like, what should they do first?
Yeah, so prior to this, obviously this athlete was a semi-final level athlete, and it's not like this was their first rodeo either. Right. Like, they were pretty experienced going into it. But we had done the volume accumulation style handstand push-up work. We had done, low intensity ski erg work. The poor guy was doing like 20-minute ski erg, low damper, pre-workout, 20 minutes post-workout, 4 or 5 days a week. Like, we had done all the stuff that you should do to improve someone's strict handstand push-up muscular endurance. And they just didn't really budge. Some days it would be 8 reps, some days it would be 10, some days it would be 11, and they would deteriorate pretty bad in Metcons. And, we evaluated movement. He had good overhead position. His jerk was strong. Shoulder press was strong. Like, all of the other stuff was pretty good. But his muscular endurance with handstand push-ups was not. And, we'd gone through all the protocols that you should go through to get someone better. We've done tricep hypertrophy work, snatch grip over, high volumes of snatch grip overhead presses, box piked strict handstand push-ups.
Did you try steroids?
No, because I think that might be counterproductive for muscular endurance, right?
Yeah,
you can get them all pumped up.
Hold on. So why did the thing we just spent an hour talking about people should do didn't work for this guy?
I think had we not done all of the things that I just talked about beforehand, I don't think that he would have responded as well to the BFR protocols. Also, those BFR protocols are advanced protocols. This athlete I'm talking about had an 8-year training history in CrossFit prior to doing this. This wouldn't be the first thing that I would give someone. Yeah. First off, it's really painful. It's not like a shortcut. So I always think that this is important to talk about whenever we bring up BFR. I think that some people hear about BFR, they're like, wow, those are amazing results. I'd love to double my strict handstand
That's what everyone listening to this podcast just did. They said, thanks for that first hour, but now I'm going to go do BFR.
Yeah, I want to go do BFR. And they think about it as like it's free lunch, right? It's not. It's a shortcut to me getting better at strict handstand push-ups. No, this is the most painful thing that you can possibly do to your triceps.
Now they really want to do it.
I was going to say,
keep selling.
Hey, what was that movie? The Dewey Cox story, Walk Hard? Yeah. And there was that guy who was like, you don't want none of this shit.
You don't want.
That's Kyle right now.
No, I'm not saying you don't want BFR because I think it's a fantastic protocol, but it's not a free lunch. Yeah. Like, if you want to get better at them, you want to use a protocol like that, you're gonna pay for it.
Yeah. And again, it is an advanced protocol. You need to start with the basics because those work best first. I think that's important to say. And another thing we really haven't talked about, I was going to mention it when we were talking about protocols, but one of the first steps is also just absolute strength. Yeah. I think people kind of miss this and like, I just need to get, let's use the handstand push-up example. I need to get them better. But like, if you don't have strength in the shoulder, it's really hard to have endurance in the shoulder. Same thing with, people talking about deadlifts. Like, the 225-pound deadlift in the open is really hard for me to cycle, but if my max is 250, then of course it is because that's 90%. Now, if I can get my max up to 450, then 225 is now 50%, and I can cycle it a little bit faster even without building quote-unquote muscular endurance. So keep that in mind that we talk about all these things, but like strength plays a huge role in being able to be enduring at the local level as well.
Yeah, movement specific,
for sure.
Like for something like a handstand push-up, that I feel like is way more important than, you need core compression strength, but handstand push-up is definitely one where we're always testing, all right, well, what's your actual pressing strength first?
And the same thing can be true in squats and hinges. Yeah. It's not the end-all be-all, but again, if your squat is stronger, then it's going to be a 95-pound or 65-pound thruster is going to be a little bit easier.
On that note, though, I think with handstand push-ups, it's a weird one where someone's shoulder press won't necessarily correlate that well to their strict handstand push-up. And I think it's just a unique movement, whereas like, Brandon, your example with the deadlift, if you improve your absolute strength in deadlift, you're absolutely going to improve your ability to cycle 50% of your deadlift 1RM. But for some reason, shoulder press and strict handstand push-ups, they're correlated, but they have like a really loose correlation.
Yeah.
I've
seen that. I've seen people's strict press go way up and their handstand push-ups not change.
Not improve.
Yeah.
Because I do think, especially if someone's already pretty strong, right? So say someone has a body weight shoulder press as a male athlete. That's a really, really strong shoulder press. Even if they weigh 175, still strong. Improving that isn't necessarily going to improve their ability to do repeated sets of 20 strict handstand push-ups. Now, to Brannen's point that he brought up earlier, if someone weighs 175 pounds and their shoulder press is 125, closing that gap will absolutely.
Well, I think
help
that's
in
most
that
people in the
instance.
sport, right? So that's something that you have to identify for yourself. But I mean, we see people all the time that come in to our online program and maybe their max squat as a male that's 185 pounds is only 225. We need to drive that up to be able to be good at other things too.
Can we just drop a hint real quick that your strict press is going to be very important in the Winners Coming Classic?
It will. That's why you chose it, because you have a good strict press. Mike's strict press is as strong as his bench press.
Mike didn't write those.
Yeah.
I wrote those.
I'm biased.
He paid you off.
He did.
He's like, put a strict press in there. All right. Any other protocols before we talk about pacing, and then we'll kind of wrap up from there?
No, we talked about some of the isolation stuff. We talked about good progressions. We talked about BFR, which, like I said, is the really advanced variation of it.
What about accumulation of just contraction volume in general? So if somebody needs like better squat endurance, muscular endurance in their quads, getting on a bike erg and accumulating a lot of time working on
100%
high RPM, low resistance to just improve the mitochondrial density in the tissue at that local level.
I think that's great, but that actually just brought up a really good idea for me, which is the old West Side style. So reverse sled drag. So if you struggle with squat endurance, put a sled on, walk backwards, walk against it, so you're actually getting some resistance in the quads. Or if it's a hinge issue, I have people sometimes load up a sled just with a 45. Go outside with a 45, do a hinge position where you're holding the straps behind your back, hinge position sled drag, and just 15, 20 minutes, you will build some serious muscular endurance. And I feel like that has better transfer back over to the sport than just doing the low intensity cyclical for muscular endurance specifically.
It's definitely worthwhile to do, because it helps you in two areas. One, your cardiovascular endurance can be improved, but it can help with mitochondrial density. Lower loading, like a ruck, is very beneficial for that, or sled. So both of those things can be done at the same time too, right? Like one of my protocols I use every single week, I don't do a ton of squat endurance work, but I will do a lot of biking into rucking, into biking into rucking, and I just touch squat endurance work once a week with the protocol I follow, and it works really well for someone that already has advanced squat endurance. So those things can work. One of my favorites is actually I stole this from
Stone Cold Steve Austin.
From Charles Poliquin. It's a hypertrophy protocol, but I've just basically used it for CrossFit. It's the 6-12-24, and it works really, really well. And you can manipulate it into 1,000 different variables, or add 1,000 different variables into it.
We've done those. We do those a lot in our off season.
Basically,
walk through one.
Basically, it would look like this: 3 sets. Let's do squat endurance to start. 3 sets of your first movement is 6 reps, so it's lower, and we want to have a heavy load for this. So we're actually challenging the nervous system. 6 back squats,
like over 70%.
Over 70%. 6 back squats at 75% of your 1RM max. Rest 30 seconds. Now you're going to do 12 single leg movements. So we'll do 12 walking lunge steps per leg. So they're going to be walking, obviously, with dumbbells. And we want something that's a moderate load that they can do really fast and keep the contraction speed up. They'll rest 30 seconds again, and then it's 24 back to either bilateral movement, or if you want to bias it, you could do unilateral movements, but maybe it's 24 thrusters for time as fast as possible.
The thrusters have been nasty. The worst ones, though, are when you write belt squats in.
Yeah, the belt squats are gross.
Oh, my gosh. That's so gross.
Could you put like 24 cals on a bike erg with damper 10 there or something like that as well?
Yep, we do that a lot when people don't have access to
and the great thing too is that you can adjust the time. So it could be rest more or rest less. It could just be 3 rounds of going straight through. That becomes more CrossFit at the end of a protocol. And then you also can add a cyclical movement in between the movements. So one of the things that I'm doing right now for both upper body and lower body, let's just say it's back squat again, 6 back squats, and then I do a 15 cal bike erg damper 10 directly into 12 walking lunges, 15 cal biker damper 10, again, standing into 24 thrusters. And then I rest a full recovery. So again, this is where I'm resting completely, probably 6 to 10 minutes. And then I repeat that for 3 total sets. It's a really great way.
I was about to say, you rest about 60, 90 seconds, Brannen.
I was thinking Brannen was going like, yeah, I'm putting a biker in between as active recovery. And I was going to be like, man, I've been experimenting with that too.
Well, that is one.
No, yeah. I've not been experimenting with that. I've been on the other end of it where I'll do like a set of strength training. So mine has been more strength biased, but like, a set of 4 or 6, and then I'll spin easy for 2 or 3 minutes, but I'm trying to get some zone 2 volume in while I'm doing my strength work. Now, I know there's going to be a bunch of people who are like, yeah, but you're getting, interference, signal interference and all this stuff. Yeah. But I don't
think it's going to be a bunch of people. It's probably
it's going to be like 2 people that are going to jump in on that. But I'm a CrossFitter. I need to be able to express my strength when my heart rate's high. So in the end, I'm not trying to get super, super strong because I'm already relatively strong for the sport. So there you go.
Man, muscular endurance is just a piece of the CrossFit equation. Anytime we do these podcasts, I just think, do you guys not just have the hugest headaches writing CrossFitters programs, having to balance all these different buckets?
Kyle said
I think it's fun.
Yeah. One, it keeps you on your toes. Yeah. So then you're always trying to learn. But Kyle, you said it well with mobility. Everything's complicated, right? But we need to distill it down to something that's a little bit easier to understand, and then also just try new things, come up with new concepts. And it's not as complicated as you think, right? Like, because CrossFit's CrossFit, there's only so many movements that they've tested, so many time domains that they've tested. And I think if you kind of see the bigger picture, then as long as you know what you're doing as far as when we're writing a program, everything else will kind of fall into place.
Yeah, I think along those same lines, if you are addressing one particular aspect of the sport, muscular endurance in this case, cardiovascular endurance, that's not necessarily going to make you better at the sport. So I think, to Brannen's point here, it's complicated, it's complex, but you also have to take a holistic view of it. You have to take a step back and really see that, like, in the end, I'm trying to get better at CrossFit. And CrossFit is most likely going to mean I'm doing lots of squats, presses, burpees, toes to bar, flexion, extension, all this stuff. I'm doing it all under fatigue. So we can categorize it however we want and break it down into its little granular parts and nuance. But in the end, you're trying to get better. So make sure that you're training the things that you need to train, and you'll likely continue to get better as long as you're addressing what you need to train.
Boom.
I was about to say, that sounded like a closing. Are we going to talk about the sports?
Well, yeah, let's over. Let's wrap it up with talking about pacing. Yeah. Mike, I think that you've done a lot of work on this because you've tried to figure, like for toe to bar example, you try to figure that out for yourself. So just give the people a couple of tips on, you don't have time to train muscular endurance. You know that your toe to bar, your handstand push-ups, your squats are going to blow up in a workout. How should you approach in an actual performance setting?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at it from like a periodizing perspective of where you're at in the season or when you want to like peak to compete to be at your best, there comes a time where you're training those qualities, and now it's about maximizing those qualities. And what that looks like is learning where those thresholds are on certain movements. So as an example, the session we did on Friday, you went out super hot and you kind of hit a wall and you like blew up a little bit. And like, I knew, being conservative, where my threshold was with like my pressing. So it was like I gamed it to get out the best effort in that, or to maximize the ability to complete the workouts. And I think that people need to have a phase where they do the training qualities, and then it's time to be like, all right, now it's time to start pacing and practicing and learning where that threshold is so I can stay just under that. Sometimes you blow up and you spill over, and we do that a lot and compete. We'll say, hey, like, really push it today because you have to learn where your limits are right now. We're getting close to competition. We're getting close to, qualifiers are open, and like, you need to go test the waters now and like really see what you can hold and sustain in these movements, and then learn from that and make note of that. So I think that gaming process comes through experience, and that's very different than training.
Yeah. Do you think a lot of people actually make the note of that, or do they just go out like?
I think that you have to make note of those things so that you can be prepared, because CrossFit's varied, and anytime a new workout comes out, like, you should have experience in your head of, all right, well, I know how this felt, so let me compare it to this scenario.
For sure. And that's where just practicing the sport, like actually doing AMRAPs and 5 rounds for time and all of that. And we have competition peak programs.
Yep.
Right now, the Legends, all those that are going to Legends, they have that in our compete program where they're peaking for that. So they're doing more Metcons, more strength under fatigue work, what it feels like to do the actual sport.
Yep.
When we come up to the Open, we'll do more CrossFit training. For those that are doing Fittest of the Coast, we'll have some stuff for them where they're doing a lot of CrossFit training. So to Mike's point, there's a time where you train it, and then there's a time where you're actually scrimmaging it. That's the word that I like to use, where you're just practicing the sport. But Mike, you said something, we say this all the time, is so important. Film yourself and then journal. Like if you really want to be better at the sport, take the time to figure out what happened on each workout and where you can get better, because that's just an easy way to then pace better on the next one.
Yeah, I mean, it has a huge impact being able to look back and know what a previous result was on something, and that makes a little difference, especially in qualifiers where it's like 5 to 10 reps is, comes down to qualifying or not. Yeah,
so, for sure.
Yep.
Cool.
Anything I want to add to that sport wise? Yep.
No, I think people tend to get lost, especially when they have access to a leaderboard. They tend to get lost between, all right now I should be training and trying to improve my max toes to bar sets, or I'm trying to improve my max handstand push-up sets, versus I'm trying to maximize my score. And I think the leaderboards sometimes can lure people into just always trying to maximize their score, which is not necessarily going to make you better in the long term.
Yep.
If someone's playing the long game, they need to have cycles or seasons, part of the year, where they're trying to improve qualities, and part of the year where they're trying to maximize their sport performance. And if you're always just trying to maximize your score on the leaderboard, which is trying to maximize sport performance, you're going to limit your ceiling in the long run. And I think that's the thing I wanted to put out there is like the pacing's important, but the pacing isn't going to maximize muscular endurance if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, time and place. I mean, we had the skills camp a few weeks ago, and I feel like every camper that came left now feeling equipped on how to self-diagnose their own limitations in certain movements. We didn't do every movement, but they now see how we have a process of breaking movements down, not overcomplicating it. But most people here had been training for a long time and had probably hit plateaus in these certain movements, and now they have an understanding of like movement, skill, global limiters, muscle endurance limiters. They like have an idea of like what things to actually focus on to actually, raise their ceiling again, instead of feeling like, all right, well, I've kind of reached my peak in it, because you haven't. You can always be better.
Let's wrap a bow on it by saying real quickly, if you were going to get muscular endurance totally wrong and you were going to be running your head into a brick wall trying to fix it, what would that look like?
Constant bodybuilding protocols. So if you struggle with your triceps or shoulders on handstand push-ups, then you're going to go and you're just going to do overhead tricep extensions. So you're just going to compound the problem. You're not addressing any of the potential underlying reasons that your shoulders or triceps are blowing up in the handstand push-up, and you're potentially compounding the problem, making it worse in the long run.
Yeah, doing just hard Metcons when you're not equipped to do that. I know that that's not fun again, but like if you just go into 15-minute AMRAPs and are doing the same movements over and over again, you'll probably get better at that test specifically because your body knows how to handle it, but it's not the best way to get better at actually improving your endurance.
Cool.
Not trying hard enough. Sometimes it's painful training and you just have to suck it up and be tough. So I'll add to that. I kind of like
it's a good thing to remember.
Contrast to those.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah.
And today's the first day of the new cycle.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm about to go out and do it right now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Any muscular endurance work
today?
No.
There will be next week. Yeah, Tuesday. There's some this week. It alternates. We have a pretty cool cycle set up where each week alternates what the focal points will be. And so this week have some high power work on Mondays. Next week there's some muscular endurance work on Mondays.
Yeah, and the Tuesday there's a nice little shoulder press drop set.
Yes, we didn't talk about drop set protocols, but also a great use.
I think that's more strength endurance than like pure muscular endurance. But
6, 12, 24 a little bit.
I did them last Wednesday, the drop sets from this week. And then I did that handstand push-up Metcon with Mike on Friday, and my shoulders and triceps were completely destroyed still from those drop sets. So everybody who goes into those drop sets on Tuesday, just be ready. Your pressing is going to be fried after that.
Yeah, I did them. I got pretty solid shoulder pump.
How many did you get?
On which I got just 6s across. They were they were terrible.
So you did 18 total reps and you were fried.
Yeah, it worked.
Yes, each one was a max effort set. That was the problem.
Oh man!
All right.
All right.
And the only way to end it, tomorrow's election day. Who's winning?
I told you, I wrote in Voldemort.
I didn't say who'd you vote for. I said
voted
who's
for the
winning.
warrior.
Just
the
keep
girl.
saying that every time. Oh man!
All right. We'll see you next time.
All right.